Well, I mean, the numbers don't lie. People have excuses, right? Or there's something that happened, whatever, that maybe you didn't do as well in a workout. But you could look at the workouts, you can look at the numbers, you can look at their strength metrics and very clearly say, here are gaps. Now, how we work on those gaps will change from athlete to athlete and the time of year and all of that. But it's very clear to say, no, like I said, you're 5 minutes slower in this 10-minute workout. So you're at 15 minutes, they're at 10 minutes. You have to figure out how to close this gap. And then we can have the conversation about what are the problems? What are the causes of this slowdown? And sometimes it maybe is just truly, they need more strength work or engine work. But a lot of times it could be a movement issue, a skill-based issue. So we need to figure that out and dive in. And that's why an assessment is just extremely important. I think that, yes, we should assess every single athlete and have a detailed plan for that, and then take them into the performance side of the sport.
Hey, it's Ben Wise, and this is The Fitness Movement. The Fitness Movement is brought to you by Zor Fitness. Zor Fitness is my company and my platform to deliver training content to coaches and athletes like you. The site has educational resources on everything from program design and exercise physiology to skill progressions and movement breakdowns. And in terms of programming, we have our online training program, The Protocol, and I also offer one-on-one remote coaching. It's all at one place, zorfitness.com. Today we have Brannen Dorman on the show, and he is a training think tank coach. I actually had two other coaches from TTT on the show, Kyle Ruth, episode number 23, and Mia Gianelli, episode 42. So be sure to check those out. They were both really great episodes. And I just respect all the people at TTT, and that's one of the reasons why I'm having their coaches on. So Brannen grew up playing sports all the way through college football, American football here in the U.S., and we basically talk about how he transitioned from that to actually owning and operating a sports performance facility where he was training different field sport athletes and CrossFitters at the time. And ultimately, he got the opportunity to coach at Training Think Tank back in 2015, and he decided to step away from his facility in order to join TTT. And one of the things that I think is really cool is he's still working with a lot of people outside of CrossFit. So obviously a big portion of his clientele is CrossFitters, but he also works with military, triathletes, weightlifters, a bunch of field sport athletes. It's just a mix of people, which is really cool. You can follow him on Instagram at Brannen Dorman _TTT. And Brannen is spelled Brannen. Today we get into how Brannen actually grounds his coaching and program design in a statistical analysis of the sport of CrossFit. So basically using the past to help predict the likelihood of future events. So one of the things that we talk about is how he sees shifts and trends happening in the recent years of the CrossFit season. How we can think about functional volume and sport-specific density, common movement pairings, the likelihood of us actually seeing certain movements at particular types of events. So for example, the frequency of running versus swimming at the CrossFit Games. We also get into the systems of how he tracks weekly movement touches, or what he refers to as these different movement patterns or buckets. Also, how he goes about testing new athletes for their relative strengths and weaknesses. And then we finish talking about how to implement these stats into actionable items for athletes listening. It's a really fun show. I know you're going to love it. So without further ado, let's get into this conversation with Brannen Dorman. Brannen, welcome to the show.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being on. So, for those of you who don't know, you at one point owned and operated your own facility. Explain a little bit about what that situation was like and kind of the clientele of who you were training and how you ultimately ended up at TTT.
Yeah, it's actually a really cool story. I guess I'd have to kind of start back at the beginning. When I was in college, I kind of got into the strength and conditioning world by doing some speed and agility work with a group called Fellowship of Christian Athletes. So at the time it was pretty big. I don't know how big the organization is now, but I played football in college. And so kind of in the summer times, I would run those speed camps. I just kind of fell in love with it. So after college, I started interviewing for some jobs. And I was like, man, I don't want to do the things that I was interviewing for. So I had a connection down in Boca Raton, Florida, and actually went down there for a year. And I was a strength and conditioning coach at a small private Christian school, and had a blast doing that. It was a good time learning and growing. But it wasn't kind of the end game, I guess I would say. I love strength and conditioning, but just not with the just 13 and 14-year-old, middle school kids. So I got connected down there with who now is a really close friend of mine, played in the NFL. His name's Brett Williams, and he was also looking to start a sports performance facility. He had the background in, obviously football, playing in the NFL, and he had connections down there. So we started what we considered a sports performance facility, but we also both enjoyed the CrossFit world. So the way that we kind of talked about this was like, hey, let's do this sports performance facility where we're kind of catering to the high school and college athletes still, like those that are prepping either to go into college for football, basketball, baseball. We did a ton of lacrosse down there in South Florida. That's super big. But at the same time, how can we set this up to have like an infrastructure for our CrossFit business? Because I was doing it at the time. And again, I really just enjoyed it and had a passion for it. So basically what we did is all our morning sessions or classes were CrossFit classes. And then the afternoon is when we would have like high schoolers come in, or we worked with Lynn University, which is down there in Boca Raton. We did stuff with their women's soccer team and their men's lacrosse team at the time. And we did that for a couple of years. And during that time, a guy walked into our gym named Dave Hochberg. And Dave basically, if anybody that's listened to this and knows him, he's been in the CrossFit space for a long time. Just massive 6'6" guy, just like stands out of the crowd. And he's so funny, like just like a true New Yorker. And he's like, you need to meet Max. You need to meet Max. And he wouldn't even say his last name. He just kept saying, Max. I'm like, I have no idea who Max is. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. Long story short, a couple of months later, he connects me with Max. Max comes down and runs a camp, and just got to know him. And for those that don't know, Max El-Haj is the owner of Training Think Tank, where I work now. We just hit it off, had a great relationship. I actually hired him to coach me in the sport of CrossFit. And through that relationship, I came on board. And then at some point in, I guess, 2014, so almost 8 years ago now, he called me and said, hey, do you want to move up to Atlanta? He was in Salt Lake at the time and was like, I'm moving to Atlanta, where Kyle Ruth's coming, Adam Rogers is coming, still coaches here at Training Think Tank, and we want you to come on. And it was like a no-brainer for me at that point. Like I loved what Max was doing. I love what he believed in. I'm sure we'll get into it with training systems, but it wasn't everything in the training world was so dogmatic. And there's a need a little bit for that, to say there are some black and whites. There are some things that we should try and probably shouldn't try. But he also was ever learning, right? Like his philosophy was always like, I want to continue to learn and upgrade my systems. Whereas a lot of the people that I worked with, or let's say the conferences that I went to, or the courses that I took, it was just like, here are your energy systems. Even in the CrossFit space, let's be honest, like you take your level 1, it's like, this is the way that things are done. And that's not a knock. I get it. Like we need some structure, but if we're not continuing to try to learn and upgrade our systems, like what are we good for if we're trying to grow kind of the fitness world and help people with health and longevity? So anyhow, that's kind of a ramble, but met Max, fell in love with him as a person and his business model, moved up here, and I've been at Training Think Tank ever since.
Yeah. I mean, I totally get the appeal of moving up there, but I feel like it's got to be a tough choice to like decide to like, I'm going to leave the facility that I have like some skin at the game at to go over this new place. I mean, was there anything more to that decision there, or was it sort of like, you know what, I think I'm just going to jump all in?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there definitely were other discussions, or there were hard decisions that had to be made. But my business partner was super supportive. He knew what I wanted to do. I still was able to help him in that process. He had other people that were in supporting roles that could help out. And so we had that conversation. I talked to Brett, who was my business partner at the time, and just basically said, hey, this is what I want to do. This is where my passions are. And I want to support you in any way that I can. So tell me, like, what's this process look like? And it was a process, right? It wasn't just like, hey, this month I'm gone. I supported as much as I could. I still wrote the training for the gym and basically was helping him out. I was writing his training at the time to kind of help guide his whole process of just health and longevity, because playing in the NFL for years puts a toll on your body. And he was offensive lineman. So he's, again, a huge guy. And so that process lasted for, probably a year plus. And obviously I'm still in touch with him. He no longer owns that facility. He's actually in Missouri now, doing something else. But yes, the decision was hard, but at the same time, it was a very clear decision, right? So like, there are some things in life that are just like, they're either way. It's like, can you go wrong, or, who knows? But for me, it was very clear that was what I needed to do. And I'm glad I did it.
Do you think it was mainly because like, you're like, I'm in love with CrossFit? I probably at the time you're competing, And it's like, I want to train people at the highest level I can. Is that kind of what it comes down to? And just being a community where that facilitates that?
Yeah, it's funny. I've had that question quite a bit of like, is it just to train high level athletes? And I enjoy training athletes that are very good. I enjoy training games level athletes or writing programs for our group training TTT Compete, which is our online training program. We had, I think it was like 16 or 17 people this year that qualified for semifinals just in a group training program. So that's fun. That's exciting. But at the same time, like I think my passion is just continuing to learn in the fitness space. And to be completely honest, I think maybe this has evolved over time, but I genuinely enjoy having a variety of athletes where they're all doing different things and have different goals, because it tests my kind of own, like, I guess mental game when it comes to upgrading my systems, kind of going back to that. So I guess to answer the question, it was more drawn to the concepts of let's continue to grow and learn together. And that was the whole concept of training think tank, right? Like the minds that we have are all different. Like we have the same goals in mind. The way that Max thinks, like if we were sitting on a podcast and Max was giving you his philosophies and then I were to give you my philosophies, and then like, let's say the other two guys that were here, Adam Rogers and Kyle Ruth at the time, we're all so different in the way that we write training, the way that we think about training. There are these bedrock principles, right? But I'm learning from them all the time. And that's like a really nice way to upgrade my own personal thoughts and systems so that I can be a better coach. And so that's what I was attracted to most. The coaching of athletes is kind of secondary to that, but it all kind of ties together, because as I learn, I can take that for my athletes. And, I work with guys and girls that are in the military, to games level athletes, masters games level athletes, to the person that's not even in CrossFit. I have, half of my clientele now, they're not even in the sport of CrossFit. They just love either like for aesthetics, or they want to do an Ironman or something else. So that is where my passion is.
That's really cool. Yeah. I think we were kind of talking about this before, but like everybody at TTT sort of has their own niche a little bit. Right. And, maybe you don't like this title, but you're sort of, in my mind, the guy who's like really good with statistics and analytics and analyzing a sport to figure out what exactly you need to do, like objectively from like a numbers perspective, to get to where the level that you want to be at. And I'm sure this maybe ties into like you were working with athletes in different sports before at this other facility, and maybe still do to a certain extent. Like you're saying, you have a variety of clientele, but like to be able to look at the demands of the sport, be able to pick that apart, and then to be able to apply it to an athlete. Do you think that those past experiences, just like growing up in athletics and training other athletes, that's where it comes from, or maybe somewhere else?
Yeah, 100%. I would say I'm, not to be egotistical, very good at identifying the separators in the sport. In other words, what can get you to, or what is you're so far behind on or ahead of the field. I'm not good at statistics. So we have other people that we lean on for that. I'm so bad with numbers when it actually comes to like, how do you scrap all this data and then figure out how to like almost like quote unquote monetize it for the sport of performance. Right. But once I have that, and I have concepts in my head, like I reach out to other people and say, hey, can you do this for me? And then once I get the numbers, I think I'm good at that. But yes, it does come from, I think mostly playing football, and then also working with other sports. We worked with lacrosse, football, basketball, baseball, kind of all the major sports down in South Florida. And then even just, again, playing football through college. I think the way that I thought about the process of being an athlete was, what things can I do to get an advantage? And I think part of that too is, especially when you're not the best athlete, like, maybe I was more gifted than whatever 80% of the field, but there's still these 20%, these other guys that are just so much better than me. And it's like always fighting for a spot, trying to figure out how to get playing time, or even if you had playing time, like the guy that I'm trying to block or beat on a pass route is just really good. So what can I do? It can't just be sheer athletic ability at that point, right? Or at least if I want to make any progress, I have to find other ways to do it. And so I think that through that process, I kind of learned, like, if I do this with my feet, if I do this with my hands when I'm blocking with as far as technique goes, and that maybe doesn't appeal to your audience, but the same thing can be transferred over to CrossFit of like, maybe this guy or girl does not have the same quote unquote capacity, but what if we just adjust their foot width in the squat to make their squat cadence 1/10 of a second faster for every rep? Will that help them? They can still take the same amount of breaks. They don't have to improve their capacity. And all of a sudden they're 3 reps better in a workout. And I know that seems meaningless until you look at the leaderboard, and then you realize, man, those 3 reps, that was 1,000 spots. That's 1,000 points. That could have got me from 11% to 10%. I make quarterfinals. And that's kind of what I look at.
Yeah. So, I think maybe if we give some concrete examples of this, I think it's going to be helpful for people listening who maybe haven't, had a chance to like hear a little bit more about what you guys have talked about. So take us through like maybe just a few stats from like the open of like, okay, these are the movement pairings you need to look for. These are the sort of rep schemes you need to look for, like that sort of thing. Like just give me a couple like random things that you think are maybe significant for like the open.
Yeah, well, it's ever changing, and so it's certainly changed the last 2 years. And what we've seen now is a different testing body than what we've seen in the past, and that's probably something that we can talk about just with the nature of now open into quarterfinals, from quarterfinals into semifinals, and then top 10% and all of that. In the past, though, if you take out these last 2 years, the movements that you have seen the most, like that's the first place that I would start. It's like, what does CrossFit bias the most as far as movement selection? And those are kind of the common things. Most people could just name those off the top of their head. It's toe to bar, chest to bar, double unders, those kind of things, right? Double unders have been in every open. The first 10 opens, you saw double unders in like an excessive amount for almost every single year in a specific workout. And so if you're not good at double unders, like the easiest way to look at this is like, hey, they're going to come out, so we need to improve on those. The next step of that is like looking at what I would call just like the average volume density, the average volume, and then the density in a workout. And this changed dramatically over the last 2 years. So we got to kind of scrap that. But in the past, like let's say the average male top 50 athlete was doing, let's say, 95 toe to bar in a 7-minute window, which is crazy if you're looking at the actual density of that in an open workout. Or the same thing is average of like 107 chest to bars in an open workout. And some of them, if you remember 14.2 or 16.2, the top males, Noah, did 160 chest to bars in that workout. So that's, again, the baseline concepts of like, what would you have? How many do you have to do in one session to be really good at the sport? And that does not mean that you have to train that volume. It just means that you have to be prepared to do, if you wanted to be a top male, 160 chest to bars in a session in an open workout that's maybe 20 minutes long or something like that. The next step after that is to look at actually the reps per second. So this becomes more important at the higher level, because if you see the best guys and girls in open workout or even a quarterfinal workout, there's not a lot of resting, right? It just really comes down to who can move the barbell or
cycle
who can
speed.
Squat. Yeah, for sure. And people kind of miss out on that. They're like, if I'm just slow and steady, a perfect example of this, and Noah got in trouble for the pistols because they no repped them.
They were good reps.
I think so too. We paused quite a bit of them. I see some of them, right? Like maybe he wasn't open, but if you pause him and some of the other guys that didn't get penalized, they all look the same. But that's another topic, right? The point there would be, how did he beat, before he got the penalty, all these other guys by like 30 seconds that also did the workout unbroken, or maybe one break in the muscle up? Like, it's just, that's crazy. 30 seconds is huge in a workout where those guys are all going unbroken. And that comes down to cycle rate. Or another perfect example of this, and I know this is high level thinking, we can kind of get to the average athlete in a second, or those that are aspiring to be quarterfinal athletes. But Mary at the games a couple years ago, when it was Frazier and Noah going back and forth, they both went unbroken on everything, the entire workout. So how was Noah a little bit faster? And it just came down to pistol speed and handstand push-up speed. Their chest bar or their pull-ups were about the same. And so you look at that, and like, those are the differentiators when you talk about elite levels in the sport. The same thing, though, can still be true if you're just good at one movement. So when I'm doing an assessment with an average athlete, one of the things that I'll look at is, we'll do a test, let's just say with chest to bars and thrusters, since that's one of the most commonly tested. I think it's been tested 5 times in the open or 6 times in the open over 12 years together. If I'm looking at that, and let's just say someone's pretty good at chest bars, their technique's clean, they have a really nice, efficient butterfly, their thruster technique is really good, the bar's in a good position, their squat pattern's really good. But if I'm timing it out and their squat's taking 1.8 seconds per rep, and I know the average is, let's just say, this is not the true number, but 1.6 seconds per rep. As silly as that sounds for most people, they're like, as long as I'm doing it unbroken, I'm doing well. It's like, well, if you're really good at the positions, let's just start practicing this in EMOMs or intervals, or maybe rest as needed sets, where I'm making you do 10 thrusters at 1.5 or 1.6 seconds per rep, so you can learn to be at that cadence. And then let's just see if we can maintain that in a workout, where you don't have to get better at anything else in this workout. You don't even have to build your quote unquote capacity, at least the way that we describe it in the sport of CrossFit, but I'm just a little bit faster at this specific movement. Or to go back to the pistol example, most people can do pistols now that are decent in the sport, but most people are just really slow at them, right? Like, I saw people hopping around on their feet, could barely stand up. Just cleaning that up a little bit can make you a little bit better at the sport. And we're not even talking about like improving energy systems or improving anything else kind of in that realm. We're just talking about movement economy. And to me, that's king in the sport. Being able to move well and efficiently matters more than anything else.
Yeah. And you bring up a really good point with like it's not just about like your capacity in terms of like the amount of work you get done in a certain amount of time, but also like if you're talking about training these things and the qualities that you're going to need to go and compete, especially if you like know what level you need to be at, like, okay, we're trying to get to a semifinal, like this is the threshold that we know we got to do these reps at, you can start to write maybe the same amount of volume or the same density of work, but the cycle speed has to be a certain, like you prescribe that, for example. So like you were saying, like maybe it's an EMOM where you're saying, okay, you've got 12 pistols in this EMOM, but you have to get them done by this second mark on the minute each time. So that you know that you're actually at like a quote, like sports specific, like cycle rate. Are there other ways besides just like EMOMs and things that you're prescribing those?
Yeah. I mean, I usually have kind of a system in place throughout the year where it progresses to a more complex and more intense structure as you get closer to the open. Just kind of periodizing the year like you'd see with any other training system in any sport. But in general, I would kind of start with the easiest thing. So under a non-fatigue state, right? Like the first step in any movement or skill acquisition is just being able to kind of learn the technique of the movement. So if we talked about a pistol as a good example of this, you have to have, the pistol requires really good ranges of motion in the ankle, the knee, the hip. You can bypass that, but it just won't be efficient, right? Like with my left leg, I actually just had a knee surgery about 2 years ago now. I was in a car accident, had knee surgery, and now doing pistols on that leg is very challenging. I can do them, but it's just slow. So to be able to get them back to an elite level, I would have to open up that knee to where I had true, like past 130 degrees of knee flexion, which I still don't have, like functional knee flexion to 130 degrees. So that would be the first step. It's like non-fatigue. I'm not even thinking about sport specific. I'm just thinking about, can I get into the ranges needed to do this movement, which would be, in this case, a pistol. The next thing then is, can I control those ranges? So like if I've thought about movement, I'm thinking about like, one is movement freedom. That's to get into the range that's needed past 130 degrees of knee flexion, or however much ankle range I need, or how much hip movement I need for that specific pistol. The next thing is, can I control it? Do I have the mind muscle, the mind body connection, whatever you want to call it, to be able to actually get into that range and then express force in that range? And it doesn't have to be a ton of force, right? Just need to be able to do a pistol. Now, if I was doing something with weighted back squats or something like that, then maybe you need more, there's more demand there. But that would be the next step. And after that, I'm going to take it into a sport specific realm, but it's still non-fatigue. So now I would have an athlete where maybe it is 10 pistols per leg. Rest is needed between those for 5 sets. And I know that sounds super simple. Most CrossFitters hate that kind of work, but it's like, all I'm working on is, first set is time how long they take you. And each set after that, try to speed it up by a second. And we're just trying to get a baseline. How fast can you do 10 pistols per leg? So 20 total pistols. And let's just say it took me a minute and 12 seconds. Okay, now our goal the next week, we're going to do the exact same thing, but the goal is to hit each set under a minute or whatever it is, right? And like easily progress the athlete from there. After they're good at that, after you can get close to the speed that you want, that what I would consider required for their goals, whatever their goals are. If it's top 10%, that's much different than making a semifinal. And making a semifinal is much different than being as fast as Noah, which is just absolute world class, right? But based on that goal, once we get them to that speed, now we can put it into kind of what I would consider like a little bit more of chaos training, but still under some control. So that is your EMOMs, where now we're pre-fatiguing it, maybe on the front end or the back end of an EMOM. Maybe it's a 20-minute EMOM where we're mixing other movements. Maybe now, to give an example of the workout, the pistols, GHDs, and ring muscle ups are all in that EMOM. So minute 1 is, 20 pistols or whatever. Minute 2 is 20 GHDs. Minute 3 is 6 ring muscle ups. Minute 4 is rest times, 20 total minutes of that, or something like that. And then after we go from there, I would make it into like a little bit more of a dense setting. So now it's intervals, 2 rounds for time of 20 pistols, 20 GHDs, 4 ring muscle ups, rest 6 minutes. So it's basically almost a full recovery times so many sets. And I'm just kind of throwing out examples. I don't even know if that would make sense. I'd have to write it down. And then the next thing would be actually putting it into a workout. So like a true 3 rounds for time, 30, 30, and 10, like you saw in the quarterfinals. Yeah.
So I think that's a really helpful model for people to think about how to build skills towards the sport. Do you prioritize like the sport specific density, the functional volume, or is it like the athlete dependent, movement dependent? How do you think about building those to maybe, say it's not, pre-comp, but definitely in like a building phase in their training.
Yeah, that's definitely athlete dependent. There's so much variance in the sport of CrossFit, from the person that's fighting for the top 10% and the person that's fighting for a semifinal, and then from the person that's fighting for a semifinal to the games athlete. Like the gap right now between the best games athletes and the rest of the games athletes, if people could see how wide that is in most workouts, you'd be shocked. Like it still is very wide. And the 40 guys and the 40 girls that make it, they're not the same, right? There are maybe 10 guys that are all just really, really good, and everyone else is kind of fighting for those spots. I know that would probably hurt some people's feelings, but that's just like, I've seen a lot of them train, and that's the reality. Now, there are outliers in certain workouts. There are guys that can still go, that maybe finish 38th at the games, that can win a workout, but they're just not as well-rounded as the Medeiros or Fraser. Like, the gap even between Fraser a couple of years ago in the games and everyone else was so wide. You just kind of see how big those can be. And the same thing on the female side with Tia Toomey. So I bring that up to say, that is so dependent on how good the athlete actually is and what their goals are. If someone, I very rarely give people a lot of volume that are trying to just make top 10%. But what I'm worried about for them is getting all the skills, because if you have all the skills in the sport, you'll make the top 10%, even if the tests are like this year where it's just capacity driven. Like you're just going to be better and more efficient at all the movements that come out. A wall walk is a perfect example. People thought like, oh, it's only 3 every time this year, so it doesn't really matter. But those that were efficient at wall walks, they're saving 5 or 6 seconds every round. Well, over, let's say they did 8, 9, or 10 rounds, that's a lot of time where they could go slower on their box jumps or dumbbell snatch and still have a decent score. Now, again, to be an elite level athlete, you just had to like sprint that workout, which is insane how fast some of the guys and girls were doing that. But I say all that to kind of preface it with, it will depend. And if it's a lower level athlete or an athlete that's just trying to qualify for quarterfinals, their volume building is skill-based volume building. Almost all year, I'm thinking about how can we clean up and make their muscle ups, pistols, GHDs, rope climbs, if they make quarterfinals, whatever, you name all the 28 plus movements that have been tested in the open. How can we make those super efficient and then just slowly add volume and some density to that? For the elite level athlete, then I'm thinking about how can I force them to get faster at doing 90 plus toes to bar in a 7-minute window, or how can I force them to get better at chest to bars in a super dense setting where their hands are hurting. That's more, they can kind of afford the pain training, so to speak. But most people at the lower level are doing a lot of what I would consider just like chaos or pain training. It's not getting them better because they're not working on the things that are holding them back.
Yeah. And I would guess you probably still do look at like some of your functional volume statistics to determine what someone even at a 88th to 92 percentile on the open might need to do. But that just results in them probably doing quality based work that maybe will over time will get them fairly close to that threshold, versus like we need to think about volume in terms of building volume to get you ready for the sport. Maybe that still applies, but so like, how does that functional volume, I guess first place would be to like explain what that is for people who are listening, who maybe don't understand that. And then what are some of the misconceptions around it? Let's start there. And then we'll tie it back into this of like how you could incorporate it into different levels of athletes training.
Yeah. The way that I would define functional volume is the volume that is needed, the volume that you have to be resilient to be competitive in the sport based on your goals. Like that's as simple as that. So in other words, if I'm just trying to make 10%, I'm looking at those numbers. How many toes to bar do I need to be able to do in a session? How many chest bars, how fast, so on and so forth, right? Go down the list of movements. The same thing is true, again, at the elite level. It's just so different because those numbers can sometimes double in a workout, right? Like I gave that example of 14.2, like Noah's doing 160 chest bars. There's no reason for the beginner to ever do 160 chest bars as much as they think maybe that they need to. Like there are other things that they could work on, or just in general, like clean up your butterfly pull-up so it's easier to do 80 really fast, because that's probably as much as you're going to do in the open. And let's just say you never trained more than 80 in a session, and all of a sudden in an open workout 120 came out. Well, if you've trained 80 consistently in sessions and you're really comfortable with the movement, you'll be able to do 120 when it counts. Like you're not going to just have this drop off from 80 is really comfortable and then I'm going to fall off a cliff for the last 40. You'll be fine. Most people end up training those, and let's just say like all the hard training programs that are out there, right? Like you scroll Instagram and there's so many people that just kind of post like the workout of the day. If you're doing that all the time, but you're not improving the technical aspects of a movement, right? Let's just go back to the chest bar for a second. You could maybe do 120, but they're just all slow and sloppy. you're never raising your ceiling. So if my ceiling's right here and I'm just butting up against that with my performance every single time I do a session because I haven't gotten any better, I'm kind of stuck in that place. Maybe I can do more reps, but they're all slow reps. So if there's a time cap on a workout, or if it's a 7-minute AMRAP, I'm actually not improving. It may feel like it's, oh, I did 130 today instead of 120 last week. But if I said to you, hey, let's really clean up your positions. Let's get your butterfly better. Let's make sure that your hips are moving first. You're not pulling with your arms. You're keeping your legs a little bit straighter as you come through with, whatever your butterfly swing. And now my ceiling is going up. My potential is still here. Now I actually have room to grow. I think that is the problem that most CrossFitters have, is they want to jump right in. And I get it, right? Like the first workout I ever did was Fran. I did Fran with strict pull-ups because I didn't know how to do a butterfly pull-up at the time, or a kipping pull-up. And I fell in love with it, right? Like I just went as fast as I could on the thrusters and died, and then did singles on strict pull-ups. I was like, man, this stuff is awesome. But I think my kind of weird analytical brain thought, well, how can I get better at the pull-up so I'm not doing singles on there? And if more people could kind of take a step back and think about that first, and not just always go to, my engine's really bad because I blew up in that workout. It's like, well, what made you blow up? And sometimes it can be like you just have a cardiac limitation or respiratory limitation. Those things are true, but most people never butt up to that because they're just not good enough at the skills to express those limitations as is.
Yeah, that's the number one thing I think about for everyone who is, not within the, top 1% of the sport. It's like below that, I hardly ever even think about capacity from a physiological standpoint. We just need to improve your engine as a whole. If you can improve the way you move and all the different movements in the sport, and because you're moving better, they're more volume tolerant, and you can do them at a faster rate and all those things, you're going to place way higher than if we just give you a bunch of rowing intervals and try to improve your engine and then do metcons with all these different movements.
Yeah. I fully agree. And there's a time and place for that. And I get that people build confidence by doing that. If they feel like they can, quote unquote, breathe better, or they just feel like they're not blowing up in workouts. I understand that. I've had plenty of athletes that we've had those battles, and I've kind of, you try to ease that addiction by giving them some of the crack, so to speak. Right. But I think the people that come to the realization of I have to dial in these big weaknesses, or again, going back to that quote at the beginning where I talked about separators, what's separating you from being your best self? Let's identify those things, those low hanging fruit first, and then kind of clean up the rest as we go up the tree. But let's figure those things out just to see how much better you can get at those first. So we can build this really nice foundation, and the house isn't built on sand. It's built on a nice concrete foundation that we have.
Yeah. So I think, something that I know Kyle has talked about when I was talking with him was you're always balancing the athlete and the sport. So you're going to have certain priorities that are athlete dependent. And then there's also going to be things that you just have to do because that's what you're going to get tested in. And figuring out how to balance, this is my individual weakness, but this is also what I need to be able to do for my sport. And if you kind of take that, again, that statistical approach to that, and figuring out if I look at maybe a past leaderboard performance, let's look at someone's 2022 open and their quarterfinals performance. Those were the two things that, that was the end of their season. Okay. If we look back at that, how do we determine what things they need to actually get better at? I think maybe a good way to think about this might be even taking into the count, the scoring system, for example. You could see okay, I have all my points came from this one workout. I got three times as many points in workout 3 than I did in all the others. How do you go about looking into that and saying what things do we need this athlete to work on to get better at the sport?
Yeah, I take the simple approach first. I will look at the leaderboard and see how many points they're accumulating in certain workouts, and then have a conversation with the athlete of why did this happen? So if we talked about this year's quarterfinals, an easy example of this, the easiest one would be the total, right? Those that just bomb that because they're just not strong. Obviously, we can look at that and say, okay, we need to do a lot of strength work. That's almost too easy and kind of simplistic of an answer to kind of leave it at that. But that would be the best way to start. With a more complicated workout, let's say workout, I don't even remember the GHD pistol ring muscle up, since we already used that as an example. Is that workout too? Yeah. Dude, those weekends, can I just say how chaotic CrossFit has made the quarterfinals. Like they release these workouts. We have 40 plus athletes on site. And I'm just like, okay, let's figure out how we organize all this. We had 2 ropes. We had 2 ropes in our facilities for 41 athletes to go through it for the rope climb workout. And it was a shuttle run. So that was fun. That was a side note.
Yeah. Even like that, it's like, oh yeah, not to go on a complete tangent, but it's like, man, it's really tough to get a facility where like, you don't want your rope to be 30 feet away from your wall ball target, even though that's allowed, but it's got to be at least 8. So it's like, man, it's really tough to make it like 8 to 10 and make that work in your facility.
For sure. That was a fun one to set up. Back to the question. I'm sorry. That workout is a good example of like, there could be multiple things that an athlete struggles with. I had athletes that were really good at ring muscle ups and they're excited for that workout, but they just really struggled with pistols after round 1, for example. So we can have that conversation of like, man, you finished, 1500th in this workout. And then the rest of your averages were, let's say 120th in the world, which are really, really solid. But that one workout kept you out. Was it muscle ups? Was it GHDs? Was it the combo of pistols, GHDs? Was it a combo of GHDs and muscle ups, whatever? And that's more the subjective side where you have to talk to your athlete. But a lot of that, if you have an athlete for a while, you kind of know where their strengths and weaknesses are because you've seen either film or if they're on site, you see them in person or you just have those conversations with them. So I'll have that conversation, look at then the internal statistics that we have. And this is outside of like an open leaderboard, but the nice thing about having so many really good athletes and so many athletes that are kind of in that bubble range, right? We have a ton of athletes that are maybe 80, 88 to 92%. I can look at where they're at, like, okay, this is how many muscle ups they're doing in that workout. This is where they finish versus top 95%, top 1%, whatever. And then kind of set some target goals for an athlete based on that. And I'll use the same workout for multiple athletes. If I write an on-site workout for a lot of our games athletes, I see their scores and I'll give them to my bubble athletes and say, all right, here's what Travis got in this workout. Here's what Alexis got in this workout. Those are the best in the world. Now we can kind of get an idea of, are we cleaning up that separation? Are we getting closer and closer, or are you falling behind? Because they're obviously continuing to improve as well.
Yeah. So I imagine it's way easier when you have an athlete that you've been with for a while, because you have like a really good sense of like, oh, I know that hip flexion is just not great for them. So, we did a bunch of GHDs and pistols. It makes sense that they were getting no reps sometimes on those pistols. Like you can just start to like, align those dots a little bit easier. When you have a new athlete, let's say someone's coming to you and you're going to onboard them. Obviously like you can, let's say this athlete's maybe they're like a semifinals hopeful, let's call them, right? Like maybe they're 300 to 400 in the quarters this year, and they come to you, and obviously like you're going to do like a bunch of data collection from what you can, right? Like go look at their leaderboards. You'll have them give you your strength metrics, any time trials that they have, all that stuff. So after that, when you actually go to start their training, obviously you're going to talk with them and all that as well. When you actually go to start their training, is that going to be like, we're going to do like fill in some of these holes from testing that we maybe see? Is it going to be like you do some more like investigative work where it's like you build some unique testers for them? Or would you rather see stuff that's you've seen a bunch of data from other athletes and so that you can then compare it to them, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it would depend on what time of the year they're starting. But let's just say that we had a little bit of time. So it's not like you're rushing into the open or some kind of like, a quarterfinal or semifinals. So let's say they came on in October and they're prepping for the next year. So like, let's say January is when our open, quote unquote, open prep cycle is going to start. We have some time. The first thing I'm doing is a full body assessment, movement assessment. I kind of alluded to this earlier, but I really do think that movement economy is king in the sport, not capacity. Capacity matters a ton. And there will be a time where everyone is just really, really fit and moves really, really well. And then maybe that changes. But right now, if you look at the sport, and it doesn't mean that they have a perfect squat position or a perfect overhead position. It just means that they're using less effort per rep in those positions than someone else. Those are the people that do really well. And that's why Fraser and Froning and Tia Toomey and others that just like move really well usually are thriving. There are other factors. Obviously, they're all like extremely gifted and they probably do have, the best engines in the sport. But I think about other athletes that also have that. You look at like Chandler Smith's a perfect example of this. If you've seen him work out in person, it's one of the most unbelievable things I've ever seen. Like he can go and go and go for days, but there are some movement restrictions that probably hold him back from honestly, I think he probably could win the games. And I wouldn't say that about many people. Like, he's that good. But, his front rack position is not great, or his overhead position sometimes is too loose when he's snatching and those kind of things. Those are things that I would look at and just try to start cleaning up right away. So I not to pick on him, just he's a perfect example of, like, he's an amazing guy. And he's like he's the most talented guy, I think, in the sport. I really do. And so it's like those are obvious examples. But I would look at the movement first. So I'm going through everything. I'm looking at from their ankles all the way up to, their cervical spine. How does everything move? And then how does it relate to the movements or demands of the sport? Like, what can we do to improve that first? And that's the first conversation that we have. Like, if someone has a really bad squatting pattern or a really bad overhead position, I want to clean that up right away, especially if we have time, because then it's going to, again, talk about raising that ceiling. We can raise that ceiling before even trying to talk about capacity or the skill limitations that they may have. And the better that you move, the easier the skills become. Like, you become more aware of your body, and you have a better, like, kinesthetic awareness of how to do specific movements. That's super important. And now, obviously, most people that are already at that level, like, they're just good at all the skills of your top 400. But that's the first step. After that, then I like to give tests that I have a bunch of data on. It just makes it much easier for the coach. And it also makes it easier for my communication with them. I have people that come on that are like, yeah, I want to make the games. All right, we give them 4 or 5 tests, and then I can show them whether they're actually close or they're not. Like, you're 5 minutes slower in a 10-minute workout than Travis or Noah. You got a long ways to go. That's 33%, right? Like, we have to really work on this. So that's kind of the next step. And then after that, I will look at the kind of the individual, like, maybe there are some things like that are nuanced. Like, maybe it is like, hey, I'm a perfect example of this. I had that knee surgery I mentioned before. Maybe they can't ever get into a perfect squat pattern. So we'll do some extra tests of, like, hey, what if we just drop that right foot back maybe half an inch and started squatting that way? I wouldn't say that for most people, but someone that, like, you got 1 year to compete, you're at the end of your career, you want to try it. All right, we can talk about that. But very rarely would I do something like that.
I love it. I think I've loved, obviously, interviewing people who I think are at the top of the field. And so many times, like, I, have this clever question that I've worded up, and it's like, they're like, well, here's the really simple answer to this. Like, I think that's exactly what you're saying as well. Like, for example, when I'm not saying I'm at the top, but when I have an athlete come to me, like, what I think about is, like, the most simple things. It's like, I just, like, look at them first. Like, do you look like a CrossFit athlete? Like, if you are 30 pounds under what the average male or female in your age group wants to be, like what that is, like, okay, we just need to put on some muscle mass. Or maybe you're, maybe it's even factors that you can't control, like wingspan or something, right? But after that, it's like, okay, what's your movement look like? Okay, can you actually do all the movements efficiently in the sport in unfatigued settings? And you start to layer it in from there based on some of the data that you have. It's really cool that, for most people, it's just, like, very straightforward, like, yeah, like what is obvious in terms of, like, the glaring holes.
Well, I mean, the numbers don't lie. I had a coach in college that always said the eye in the sky never lies, talking about the camera that they would record every practice, which was true, because you'd get in trouble if you didn't do something correctly. The same thing is true in this sport. The numbers will not lie to you. People have excuses, right? Or there's something that happened, whatever, that maybe you didn't do as well in a workout, but you could look at the workouts, you can look at the numbers, you can look at their strength metrics, and very clearly say, here are gaps. Now, how we work on those gaps will change from athlete to athlete and the time of year and all of that. But it's very clear to say, no, like I said, you're 5 minutes slower in this 10-minute workout. So you're at 15 minutes, they're at 10 minutes. You have to figure out how to close this gap. And then we can have the conversation about what are the problems? What are the causes of this slowdown? And sometimes it maybe is just truly, they need more strength work or engine work. But a lot of times it could be a movement issue, a skill-based issue. So we need to figure that out and dive in. And that's why an assessment is just extremely important. I think that there was a time, maybe a couple of years ago, where everyone, like, kind of like the assess don't guess crowd, kept saying that. And I appreciate that. But we've kind of gotten away from that a little bit. So I think it's just kind of finding that balance of, like, yes, we should assess every single athlete and have a detailed plan for that, and then take them into the performance side of the sport.
Yeah, I think, having these kind of flags along the way where you can, like, point to an athlete, like, okay, this is the metric that you need to be at. and like it's very objective. It's like, this is where people are at, this is where you're at, and you can give them some data that's like really obvious. I think that's where like a lot of the stuff that you're doing is super helpful. And then you can combine that with like more so like artful program design, where it's like a little bit more, subjective. Like there's multiple ways that you could do it right, and you can basically, there's like multiple ways to skin a cat, right? Like you can
Sure.
give an athlete all these different protocols to improve their squat, knowing that maybe their squat clean was a deficit in the total, for example. And it maybe just allows you to like back up some of the protocols that you would give them and say, okay, this is like the data, and then this is maybe how we're going to go about it. And we can kind of like merge those two things of like, again, sort of like the art and science of program design. It's pretty cool. All right. I got a question about systems.
Okay.
This is, I mean, if I'm someone listening, or, even like just me trying to like hear you talk about this, I think like, man, like you've got all these different stats that you have, and it's really easy to like, as maybe someone who is maybe listening to this, to like think of like this is a stat and this is a stat, and it's like, they're cool, but like, how do you like organize them into something that's a little bit more meaningful for an athlete or for yourself as an athlete? So, I'm sure there's ways that like you can organize all this information into something that's usable for athletes. So for example, like we know that maybe wall balls are 1.8 seconds a rep, or that, you are twice as likely to see, maybe 3 times as likely to see running as swimming at the games, for example. How do you, like, in terms of like your systems, how do you organize all that information?
Yeah. So I guess the simplest way that I do it is I put things into buckets. So, and this probably doesn't answer the question fully, so I'll kind of come back to that. But the first thing I'm thinking about is just like patterns that we see. And what I mean by patterns are movement patterns. So there are so many different variations of, let's say, squats that could be tested, or so many variations of, pressing that can be tested. So I put those into buckets first to make sure that we're covering, kind of hedging our bets on the bucket. So I have a flexion bucket, which is all our squatting. I have a hinging bucket, which is anything pulling off the ground. That's deadlifts, power snatches, power cleans. I would even consider that the squat variations of the Olympic lifts, so on and so forth. Anything we're pulling off the ground. I have an upper body pressing bucket and an upper body pulling bucket. And that doesn't include any of the cyclical stuff. We blend that in, obviously, and that can go into any of those buckets. But those are just the movement buckets. If I'm touching all of those throughout a week, or consistently through a cycle, at the baseline, those people will be getting better at that flexion pattern, or at that upper body pressing pattern. So that's the first thing I'm looking at. Now, to get more specific, I look at the end of the season, like I just went through like post quarterfinal calls, for example, and I'm evaluating with the athlete, okay, what do we do well? What do we do poorly? Where are the biggest weaknesses, or what are the limitations that are holding you back? And if there are specific movements within one of those buckets, we'll just touch that more often. So let's say it's strict handstand push-ups. That workout was super tough for most people, and they really struggled with the strict handstand push-ups. Part of that was probably just the overhead lunge, and maybe that combo is something that we need to work on. But if it was a handstand push-up with upper body pressing bucket, we're just touching that more often. And so the way that I write my programming, I have a profile for an athlete. I have a list of all the things that are their priorities on the side of a Google sheet, essentially. And I'm looking through there, and then I'm controlling the volume from week to week, and then progressing it based on those 4 buckets, and then based on the individual characteristics that I want to touch within those buckets. And I'm realizing I'm saying bucket a lot, so sorry to your audience, but you get the point, right? These, I don't know what else you would call it, these systems that I have. As far as movement selection goes, at a broad level, like you mentioned, running being tested more often than swimming, that's 1000% true. And it's actually even more than 3 times. Swimming was tested only like 3.5% at all the sanctionals in 2018, yet people were swimming 3 and 4 times a week to prep for it. And again, like if people want to do that and they think it's going to help them, that's awesome. But the reality is like, if running is tested 5 times at a sanctional or 5 times at the games, you better be better at running than you are at swimming. If it's only 100 points of swimming, then it's okay if you finish with 60 points there. But if you finish 5 times with 60 points in running, you're really screwed. So, and I am passionate about that. We've had this discussion on site a ton. I'm just like, look, we have to look at the numbers. They're not going to test swimming 3 or 4 times at the games, because it would just be logistically impossible. And watch them do it this year. Who knows? But I want to make sure that my athletes are efficient in the water, But until they test it 4 or 5 times, the priority there is going to be running. And that's, again, a very simple example, but it's so true. Like running, I think was it 5 times that was tested last year at the games? I have a sheet on it. But
yeah, the 2021 games, the one where there's only 5 people, it was so many of the events because it was at the ranch. So
that's right. That's right.
It was like when they didn't know what to do, it was just running all the time. It was like they had to run up the hill, run around the thing, and then he tells them to run again. They're like running in the Happy Star event with the burpees and thrusters.
That's right.
Oh, the last event with the vested run, it was all over the place. And I think that was really like it's so clear. Like, okay, at the games, you have to be a really good runner.
Yeah, well, and it crushed Noah. Like that really was a rough year for him. But a lot of that was because he didn't do as much running as he probably should have. And he would admit that, right? Like he was working on other things. And that's also a funny conversation that we can have about, programming and the testing body from one year to the next. If it changes, then the top 10 will change a little bit. Now, most of those guys are well-rounded enough that it doesn't change a ton. And probably Frazier would have won no matter what. But the top, maybe 2, 3, 4, and 5 change in an event like that, especially with only 5 guys. But yeah, that's a perfect example of there are just things that are obviously tested more often. I just off the top of my head, I was talking to someone the other day, but when they did have sanctionals for the 2 years they had it, one of the things that everyone biased was snatches and muscle ups. Muscle ups were tested, I think, 18 or 19 times in 10 sanctionals. So it's like almost twice every single sanctional. Well, you better be working on that. Whereas a sandbag carry was only tested 1 time, but we see again, so many people playing with sandbags all the time. And this is not a knock on that. I program for my high level athletes. They're doing strongman work every single week. But if I'm looking at my side where I have all these buckets, I'm thinking it's tested at a 1.2% rate. All right, we're going to make sure that they're getting a touch on that so that they're competent in the movement. But I know that their muscle ups aren't very good, and they tested bar muscle ups and ring muscle ups at this event that they're going to. Let's say semifinals. I have an athlete that's going to be competing in the first one. I've looked at the programming from what obviously they didn't have it last year, but what MAC has done over the last couple of years. Now they're programming for Syndicate Crown. I'm trying to figure out what are the things, what are the priorities, what are their biases that they've had. And then the same thing is true with maybe, is it, Bosman who's writing or other people that may be helping for the 2 semifinals, the 2 workouts and semifinals that will be from CrossFit. I want to just try to hedge my bets. I want to know what their biases are. I went back and I don't even know if he was writing it. I've just been told that he was, but the San Francisco CrossFit back in the day and other things I can find, anything from Bosman that he's written. And I want to see what his biases are. I'm not making that my gospel because that's a dangerous game. It was a dangerous game with Castro, right? But I do know that everyone, if I wrote the CrossFit games, there would certainly be biases in there that these other coaches here would know what they look like if I wrote it. And the same thing, if Max wrote it, I could figure out what to train my athletes for because I've seen enough of his train or programming. So even if they try not to be biased, everyone is to some extent. And I know this is kind of getting off that question, but those are the things I'm looking at, trying to figure out, are there any advantages that I can give my athlete? I don't know the workouts, but I can at least look back and see what these guys or girls have written in the past and come up with some ideas.
Yeah. So like, I guess practically this is like, okay, when I'm writing programming, I have, maybe this other tab open where it's like, I'm trying to check off these movement categories on a weekly basis and trying to make sure that, I'm building this athlete in the way that I want them to move based on the time of year, based on their unique needs towards like their point in the season where they're going to get tested. So that could be like movement patterns. Are there other things that you like, maybe like time domains, or is that more like based on like functional volume, or is that like, again, like the density? How do you, is it mainly like the movement patterns? And then it's like maybe based on some of like the other maybe energy systems, like cyclical testing that you've done, you can start to see where the other holes are?
Yeah, I think that's probably the hardest thing in the off season is figuring out time domains, because a lot of times you just work so focused on skills that you're not as worried about time domains. But basically what I do is I'll have a template written out. So let's just say that I'm starting someone in their off season. I want to write an 8-week template for them. I will just have, like, if you thought about a Google sheet, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, off Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Like that's a typical CrossFit split. I will first put in what are the priorities on Monday, then Tuesday, then Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, right? And then I will go down from there and build out a skeleton of the days. So Monday, I have these priorities. And then the first week, Monday, here are the movement patterns, the buckets from that I want to touch. Here are the time domains I want to touch. Here are the strength systems that I want to touch. And I'll kind of go down all for Monday through the 8 weeks. And then I'll do the same thing for Tuesdays and then Wednesdays. And then once I have it all written out, I'll see if anything conflicts. Like, okay, does it make sense to do Monday and Tuesday like this back to back, and then Wednesday and so on and so forth? Now, I know that seems very tedious and like it would take a long time. And I mean, there's definitely a lot of time that goes into that. When I started, it would take me forever. But now I have like kind of the way that I write, I can think about it quickly. And then it's just kind of the review piece each week of like, okay, I'm making sure that I'm hitting all these things. I'm looking back at, those buckets I talked about, the time domains. I do kind of check on that, but it's kind of like, that's maybe secondary or kind of tertiary to the other things that I think matter most. And then any of the other skills that they need to work on. But the template guides that process. It makes it much easier to not have to worry about a checklist because I already have it written out. That's the first thing that I'm doing is I know exactly what I want to work on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday. And then I can just fill in the weeks from there.
Do you worry about that less, like the interference from like one day to the next or one session to the next with higher level athletes? So for example, like if you did, I would call them like hanging gymnastics on like a Monday, right? Maybe it's like upper body pulling in your classification. Then is it like you really try to give them a certain period of time to recover from that if for a higher level athlete, or is it more like, you still got to be mindful of it, but you can give them way more frequent doses? Is there like a way that you think about that based on athlete ability level?
Yeah, in the off season, I try to spread it out as much as I can early. And as we get closer and closer to the season, I'll make it more dense. And with higher level athletes, I'll make it super dense. They may do the same thing 2 days in a row on purpose, getting close to a competitive season, especially if they have on-site competitions that they're doing, because what we've seen, right? Like they may do bar muscle ups and front squats on a Friday at Wadapalooza. And then they have ring muscle ups and thrusters on a Saturday. Not that they did that this year, but just in general, they've done things like that in the past. So if you're never training that, then it's going to be really hard for the athlete to feel resilient and confident to be like, they can pull back in the memory bank of like, oh, just 2 months ago, I did a really hard Metcon with squats and muscle ups. And then another one with squats, muscle ups the next day. With lower level, I don't want to say lower level, with those beginner level athletes, I rather wait on that to make sure that, again, their skill, that they have improved enough on the skills that that's not the bottleneck that's holding them back. If they are competent at muscle ups, both bar and ring, and at squatting, and they can handle the volume, I may dose that in there. But it's certainly not something I'm thinking about actively like I am with a high level athlete.
Yeah, that's fair. All right. Final question for you. So again, I think of all the information that we've talked about, and again, a lot of people just could be overwhelmed by it or maybe not know what actionable steps they can actually take from it. Let's say we have someone listening and they're self-coached, or, they're not maybe directly working with a coach who would take care of this for them. Say they just got done with quarterfinals fairly recently, and they're looking back at their performance and they're trying to like boil all this information down into something that's actually usable for them. Like, what are some basic ways that they could, think about what is limiting my performance?
Yeah. Well, I think I would say hire a coach and at least get an assessment by someone that knows what they're doing. I used to answer, I've had so many people ask that question, and it's a good one, but the reality is it's like, I just don't know. It's too easy, even for myself. Like, I pretend to know all these things, but I would not try to coach myself if I wanted to be a competitive athlete. It would be too easy for me to bias the things that I just want to do and like to do. And I could pick out the things that I'm bad at. Like, I know what those are and start working on them, but there'd be something else that I'm leaving behind because I just don't want to mess with it. You know what I mean? And so even if you say I'm the most honest person, I'm not biased at all, you are going to be. And it's just nice to have another set of eyes on you too. Like someone to kind of watch you and tell you to kind of tweak some things, or just for accountability, like having that person that you can lean on. And that's what a coach should be for. Is part of it is helping with program design, but also part of it is like I don't want to call it a life coach, but also helping through all the other performance issues that happen in a season. So that would be my answer. If you're not going to do that, I think that the first step is to look at the leaderboard and then like objectively look at leaderboard. I felt bad in this workout, so I need to work on this kind of thing. Or it can't be as simple as I just need to build my capacity. I heard that a lot after the Open, because those were mostly capacity driven test. But we talked about this in one of our training think tank podcasts, I don't know, maybe a month ago with Max and I, but the deadlift burpee workout's a good example of this. Most people walked away from that thinking, or crawled away from that thinking like, man, I just need to build my engine up. But it's like, if the deadlifts really crushed you, maybe it is just like true strength. And then once you build your deadlift strength up, build your strength endurance with pulling off the ground. That's going back to that hinging bucket. And then after that, we can talk about burpees and your overall ability to kind of perform well with a high capacity workout. But most people probably just will hammer deadlifts and burpees all year, and then maybe only improve by a few reps, as opposed to getting their deadlift stronger. Now 225 or 155 feels a lot easier.
Yeah. It's really easy to skew all your training to one way, especially if you are looking at it, for yourself rather than having a coach do it for you. So yeah, I totally agree. Like having a coach, it's like, man, obviously a lot of people come to a coach and they're like programming, which is like true. And that's a big part of it. But the other thing that you mentioned that I really liked was like, having a coach there's ways that they really can push your performance in terms of like where you end up on game day that are huge, that have nothing to do with program design.
For sure.
Yeah. All right. I'm sure that you are probably full with your clientele. Is there anything that you want to let people know where they can find you and follow you, or anything more about you?
No one wants to follow my social media because I do not do social. I hate social media. But you can follow Training Think Tank. Chris, who does all our social media, does a great job, and we put out some really good content. And I certainly am biased, but I think we put out some of the best content as far as fun, entertaining, and educational. So definitely at Training Think Tank on Instagram, or just check out our website. We have some great stuff on there. The Classroom is our educational platform, which basically, if you want to learn about how to be a better coach, or that's a great step too. If you don't want to hire a coach, but you want to coach yourself, go to the Classroom and you can kind of check out all the, kind of the nitty gritty of program design and how we think about energy systems or strength systems. That's where I would start. And then, the other thing too is like there's so many good programs out there, not just ours. There are plenty of other options. But the one thing I would say for people, and I know this is not about me, but in general, find something and just stay consistent for a little while, whether it's with us or not. Now, I would say the best, most well-rounded program would be, following one of ours, or obviously, again, I'm going to say that, but just be consistent. So many people now in the CrossFit space are jumping from one program to the next. And the one thing I hear all the time is like, oh, it just wasn't for me. It's like, well, how do you know? Why would you sign up for something and then just say it's not for you? Like, I mean, unless you don't care about your performance, stick with something for a while, just see if you actually can make some progress.
I love it. Brannen, thanks for doing this today.
Yeah. Thank you, Ben.
Hey, it's Ben again. Thanks for listening today. To be completely honest, it's been really rewarding to have people who listen to the show regularly reach out to me, whether they have a question about training or just to say hey. So if you haven't done that yet, do it. I'm pretty good about getting back to people, and you can feel free to email me, ben@zorfitness.com, or message me on Instagram @zorfitness. And graciously, I've had some people reach out to me and ask how they can support the show. Number one way that you can support the show if you are a regular listener is just by rating the show. Most apps have a platform where you can actually rate it, and on Apple Podcasts, you can write a review as well. This is super helpful in having other coaches and athletes find the podcast, but also just having it grow and for me to continue to want to put out more and more content. Also, I'm going to be posting more full episodes of the Fitness Movement to our YouTube channel. So if you're someone who actually enjoys seeing my face when I talk, you can head over to YouTube and subscribe if you please. And if you're someone who is watching on YouTube, you have the ability to like our videos, but then you can also comment on the video if you have questions about the episode, or if you want to suggest a topic for a future episode. And lastly, if you're someone who really does value what we're putting out, I would encourage you to hire a coach. For me, coaching is the bulk of my job, and it's what I believe I do best. So if you're an athlete or a coach looking to up your fitness game, be sure to reach out. You can message me on Instagram @zorfitness, or email me, ben@zorfitness.com. Thanks again for listening today. And as always, stay the course.